My parents got divorced early on. You know, my mother was one of 24 children, got married at age 13, trying to escape desperate poverty in rural Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they moved to Detroit. My father was a factory worker. Years later, she discovered that he was a bigamist, had another family, and of course that resulted in a divorce. She only had a third-grade education, so we ended up moving to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, murders. Both of my older cousins were killed. I saw people lying on the ground with bullet holes in them, dying. But the thing that impressed me the most were the roaches. They had large, aggressive roaches. You know, in the more upscale areas, they call them water bugs, but we knew what they were. And not only would they crawl on your table, they would crawl in your cereal box. So if you were eating Raisin Bran, you had to know what those brown things were. I shouldn't talk about that now that I'm on the Kellogg board. And then the rats, they were so big. The first time I saw one, I thought it was a dog. I mean, these things were amazing. But while we were there enjoying that environment, my mother was out working extraordinarily hard, 2, 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning people's houses. And she really had an intense desire not to be on welfare, because she, with her third-grade education, noticed that no one she saw go on welfare ever came off of it. And for the most part, she was able to avoid assistance. She occasionally accepted some, but for the most part, she was able to stay off of it. And it was an amazing thing. Now, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, Carson's a hypocrite because, you know, he wants to get rid of welfare, even though he may have benefited from. Well, first of all, it's a total distortion and a total lie. But I'm getting used to that. You know, I don't want to get rid of safety nets for people. What I want to do is get rid of dependency in our society. That's what we want to do. And I think that is such an important concept, particularly for conservatives and the Republican Party, to make that a part of their platform. The so-called war on poverty, initiated by Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, what did it accomplish? After trillions of dollars were spent. Is anything better? In 1969, 1.4% of the population was on food stamps. Now it's over 14%, a tenfold increase. And there's more poverty, more crime, broken families, out-of-wedlock births. Everything that it was supposed to help is much worse. So what does that mean? Well, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time pointing fingers at people, but we do need to activate our brains, because what would an intelligent person do? They would say, we've poured all this money and energy into this, and everything is worse. Therefore, we need to take a different tack. What would a person who fails to connect to the circuitry of their brain say? They would say, we didn't do it enough. We need to do more. And see if you can figure out which group is which, you know? And you know, it's one of the reasons that we seem to fail to make progress, even in areas where the solutions are obvious. Common sense does not seem to prevail. And what I've discovered is that it's not so much that people don't have common sense in Washington. It's that there's a lot of special interest in Washington. Anything that comes out of Washington that doesn't make sense, I can guarantee you there's a special interest group behind it somewhere. And it's so important that we break the ties with the special interest groups. Certainly, some of the lobbyists may have important things to say, but we can never put the interest of a special interest group above the interest of the American people. We have to prioritize. Well, at any rate, there we were in Boston in this horrible situation. And, the thing about my mother is that she refused to be a victim. And she never felt sorry for herself. And that was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So, there was never an excuse that was good enough. And, that was problematic for my brother and me because we wanted to make excuses, but she wouldn't accept them. And, that was probably the best thing she ever did for us because if someone will not accept your excuses, then pretty soon you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. And isn't that really what leads to success? Well, at any rate, her real goal was to get back to Detroit. And after a couple of years, we were able to get back to Detroit, amazingly enough. Still in a multi-family dwelling, still with significant wildlife, but nevertheless, she was independent, and I was a terrible student, probably the worst student you've ever seen in your entire life. But I must say that I admired the smart kids. I couldn't figure out how in the world do they know so much stuff. But, I would never admit to them that I admired them, but I really did. But the kind of student that I was reminds me so much of so many students and adults that I see these days who simply do not avail themselves of information. A lot of people, they have their little smartphone on their hip, and they say, I really don't need to know very much. All I need to know is how to operate my phone. Here's the problem with that line of thinking. Everything that you hear, you process immediately based on what you know. And if you don't have a good fund of knowledge, it's very easy for people to put things over on you and to influence you, even in a subconscious way. And you really won't even know what's going on. And that's why it's important to arm oneself with knowledge. Also important to engage in conversation, to talk to people, even to talk to people you don't agree with. It's important because it helps you to solidify your own belief system. And sometimes challenging them will help expose some of the erroneous thinking, but it's particularly true amongst left-wing people because I find for the most part, they cannot explain the rationale for their beliefs, which is why they don't like to talk about them, why they much rather call you names and attack you than actually talk about their belief system and what it's based on. And a very good thing to do when you run into people like that is force them to talk about their beliefs. And when they attack you, just say, now that you've completed your gratuitous attack, let's get back to the subject. Let's hear why you believe and what is it based on. And in many cases, they will get frustrated or they will storm away because they don't want to admit that they cannot defend their positions. I wouldn't be mean to them because sometimes there are people who actually think about what just happened. They may go home, they may lay in the bed, and some of them may actually begin to think in a logical fashion. And that's really the goal. The goal is not to punish people who don't believe in things that make sense. The goal is to help move them in the right direction. One of the real problems in America today is that we've allowed the purveyors of division to politicize everything. So issues that are really not Democrat versus Republican are made into Democrat versus Republican issues when they are really American versus non-American issues. And that's what we need to be talking about. Well, you know, my mother fully understood the importance of education. And she was really rather alarmed that I was doing so poorly in school. My brother was doing poorly in school. And she didn't know what to do, so she prayed and asked God to give her wisdom. You know, that's the wonderful thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. And she had faith that he would give her the wisdom, and he did, at least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was wise at all. I mean, turning off the TV and making us read books and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And, you know, the interesting thing was, because I had to read those books, I actually started to enjoy them. Because we were desperately poor, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I started reading about people of accomplishment. I became aware by looking at their lives that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. Had a profound impact on me. Within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to laugh and call me dummy, who were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, I just had a very different impression of who I was and what a difference that makes. But, you know, when you stop and you think about the fact that we are made in the image of God, and God is no dummy. We have these amazing brains with these huge frontal lobes. Frontal lobes where you engage in rational thought processing, the ability to extract information from the past and the present and to project it into a rational plan for the future. And that's all we need to do, is start using that brain in a rational way. Because the problems that face us right now are problems that I believe are relatively easily solved if we take them out of the political arena and we start thinking about what is good for our nation.